All right.
Great.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Sila Abjol. I'm the program manager for Global Ties Albuquerque. We have partnered up with Dr. Montoya from the Anderson School of Management and the Latin American and Iberian Institute of UNM to present to you guys the World Heritage Convention Revisited series. So I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Montoya.
Thank you, Sila. Thank you so much. And welcome, everybody. Thank you very much for being on our second session. We had a small but lively discussion last time. And on behalf of the Anderson School of Management, and also recognizing the Latin American Iberian Institute and Global Ties Albuquerque as our host, I'm really grateful for the opportunity to keep the conversation going alive. I'm going to throw on my presentation in a moment, but I just want to take a moment to recognize the attendees and the panelists that are here. Thank you, David, who's my my GAA and my official essential assistant in this endeavor. Sila, Yuri, thank you guys from Global Ties. I really appreciate that. And Francis, thanks so much for being an interlocutor as we were preparing the discussion. I also want to recognize our attendees. We have a small group, so everybody feel free to interject questions whenever you want during the presentation, and we'll make sure, Sila is going to be monitoring that. We'll make sure to address those questions in real time so that we can keep that conversation going alive. So thank you, Alejandro, Celeste, Dr. Nakla, thank you very much for being here. And Emmy Tither, I don't know you, but welcome. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of share the directions for the hour. An hour is not a lot of time, given that the presentation is, there's a lot to talk about. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to share screen now, and I'm going to begin with a recap of our last presentation. And if anybody has a chat, I may not see it, but Sila will be monitoring and will interject whenever is necessary. I want to take a moment to also recognize that this is a discussion that's been going on in many circles at UNM and many other parts of the world for a long time. This is nothing like extremely novel, but I thought as we were discussing the onset of the 50th anniversary of the World Heritage Convention, it's a really important topic, and one that I think we're going to have to revisit in many different contexts for a very long time, particularly given climate change. But I do want to recap a couple of things for those of us that are new to the sessions, and I want to just kind of acknowledge that that the sessions are moving along quite well. This is part 2. Just a reminder, the World Heritage Convention is the thing we're talking about today. It was established in 1972, and it was a convention that defined the kind of natural and cultural sites which would be considered for inscription on what we call the UNESCO World Heritage List, UNESCO being United Nations Education, Social, and Cultural Organization. There are 1,154 total sites as of 2021. And the major criteria, I'm not going to go into the details, but the major criteria of the Convention for World Heritage is being of cultural or physical significance to humanity. And we've talked about examples in the last session, both in New Mexico, since we're out of Albuquerque, New Mexico, having this conversation, but also examples throughout the world that have a lot of notoriety and can be recognizable by almost anybody on planet Earth. When we last left this discussion, we talked about the way that nations serve as the dominant proxy for the state or state duties that UNESCO sites rely on in the convention. In other words, in order to take care of World Heritage, you have to have somebody who's responsible, who's willing to assume responsibility for preserving this concept of World Heritage wherever that physical location is contained or located. We talked a lot about non and pre-national forms of World Heritage that aren't contained by nationality. We talked about the nation as a state sponsor, quote unquote, and how that's problematic and what could replace that. Noting that international does not always mean global. And so where is that institutional authority wherein World Heritage is going to be preserved in the future? And it's not always located in nationality. So to quote our guest from the last session, Ambassador Jorge Lozoya, he was talking about the soul of a place. And the question became, what is the adequate container of the soul of heritage, and how we belong to the world? For those of you that want to see that video, there is a link to that video in the Global Ties YouTube channel. That's going to be available on this link right here. And I'll also make sure that the link is available on social media and feeds through Global Ties so that people can check out the YouTube recording of that video. So today we're going to discuss agriculture. And we're going to discuss agriculture as both as a natural landscape, but also as a form of world heritage. A couple of things that we need to acknowledge about that, and it's not shocking. This isn't world-breaking or earth-shattering news, but I mean, agriculture, we can accept that it's it's the preeminent and arguably the single most dominant part of how we produce and consume in the world. And it's the artifact that defines civilization in both its cultural and natural forms. I think it's important to recognize at this point that one of the discussions that's been happening at UNM happened before COVID. It was in 2018, and it was this presentation. I will show that more clearly when we get back on, but it was a symposium called Rural Transformation in Latin America's Changing Climate, which was organized by several members of the Latin American Iberian Institute, particularly Chris Duval, Jamie Nelson Nunez, Marigold Walsh-Dilley, and Ben Warner. They were part of a Greenleaf symposium that discussed a lot of this. And so there is kind of an archive of a lot of these issues that are already available to us in a larger context through UNM. So thank you for that and those research efforts. There's a couple of things I tried to organize before we talked about agricultural landscapes. And one of them is that here's some facts that I thought were going to be easy to compile on the statistics page of UNESCO, but they weren't. And so I ended up actually having to do a tally of my own. So I'm actually now thinking, Francis, you're more than welcome. Emil, you're welcome. Anybody wants to do a peer-reviewed journal on this, we could totally actually start building off this data set, because it took a long time for me to build out some of this. But here's some fast facts about agricultural landscapes and UNESCO World Heritage Sites. 8 of 10 UNESCO Heritage Sites are in the danger list. In the endangered list are natural sites, they're natural landscapes. Half are mixed cultural and natural sites. So when they get the designation, it's either cultural under those criteria or under natural as those criteria. The difference between Taos Pueblo, for example, and Carlsbad Caverns. But some of them have both. And 6 of 10 of those heritage sites on the danger list are agricultural. Just to do a total tally, 39 of the total properties of all UNESCO sites are mixed cultural and natural. That's not a whole lot. So it's very rare for that designation to actually be both cultural and natural. And 218 of the total properties are natural. Of those, because the designation is very hard to kind of flesh out, 104 of all UNESCO World Heritage Area sites are agricultural, both historical and or in use. Those are a good way for us to get started on agricultural landscapes within the UNESCO World Heritage designation. I saw the chat thing come up. Are there any questions, Sila?
No, I was just reminding everyone to feel free to insert their questions in the chat or in the Q&A, and then I'll let you know.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you. So here's a couple of examples of UNESCO agricultural landscapes. The agricultural landscape of Southern Uland. I forgot the umlauts there, my apologies. That's in Sweden. The Palmeral of Elche, which is in Spain. And then the Jatiluwi rice terrace in Bali, Indonesia. And those are, they both have elements of cultural and agricultural elements within the criteria for their application. So they have either historical, or even in the case of the Southern Uland site, have a pre-modern agricultural quality that is recognized by UNESCO as having global importance. So UNESCO agricultural landscapes, they bring up a very interesting problem. And one of the readings assigned, well, not assigned, I feel like a teacher all over again, but one of the readings that was distributed were, can rivers have human rights? And this leads to a concept called environmental personhood. Can a river have human rights? Should trees have standing, legal standing or otherwise? We can define environmental personhood as the idea that a natural landscape has the same rights of a legal person, entitled to independent regard and consideration. And that's very similar to the concept of corporate personhood, which declares that a business like Royal Dutch Shell actually has rights and responsibilities, even though it's a corporate structure, it has legal rights kind of associated with that. So one of the things I want to bring up is that we have these natural landscapes. The majority of them are actually the ones that are endangered within the danger list for global heritage. Agricultural sites are not only just quaint reminders of a past, they actually are also value systems that are organized and can remind us of certain habits and practices that we have around what we produce and consume in the world environment. They tell us a lot about the state of affairs on planet Earth and about the fragility of our ecosystems. There's lots of different ways in which agricultural landscapes become key and vibrant indicators for what we are in the world. One of the problems, though, is that this idea of personhood is a problem of what anthropologists primarily would call Anthropocene. The idea that we kind of organize all of these rights and these responsibilities as human-centric type of problems. And my question, one of the ones that I want to pose and continue through this thread, is can human laws be transcribed beyond human language, and how is that a problem for world heritage? Can agricultural landscapes have those kinds of rights? And what is the human interface that serves as a proxy for agricultural landscapes? If we needed to connect it to human rights, the human rights part is the important proxy there. A good example of that is the Ley de Derechos de la Madre Tierra, which is a law that was passed in Bolivia in 2010. And that law grants legal rights to planet Earth as a human being within the legal domain of Bolivia. So in Bolivia, ostensibly, if you litter, you're not just littering, you are guilty of assault, because the body of the landscape actually has the rights afforded to another person. So there is kind of a protection of space, even quote unquote, the personal space of the planet has some sort of limited guarantees and rights within this law. Very difficult to execute and to enforce, but it is a law that projects a value system. And that's something that I think goes into this bigger equation of why are agricultural landscapes such an important part of world heritage, and what are we missing inside of the original convention? So one of the things that gets identified, agriculture gets mentioned, but it gets mentioned particularly in relation to cultural heritage, but it doesn't necessarily recognize the transnationality of agriculture. Agricultural products, but also even the landscapes themselves, are and always have been transnational. And they've actually been the source of many disputes wherein nationality is determined. So even when self-contained, there's implications for cultural exchange and for the supply chain. And one of the things that then emerges later on, and we had a participant in our last session refer to WIPO, which is the World Intellectual Property Organization. But there is this kind of connection also between agricultural landscapes and denomination of origin, or what we would refer to as terroir. And it's also mythological. It's the way we think about being in the planet. So there's an image I put here of Gaia olive oil, and that's actually their entire branding strategy, is to talk about how olive oil is one of the most important parts of global food habits. And talks about the relationship between the human body and Mother Earth, Gaia, in that context. So there is this kind of anthropomorphization of Mother Earth, and the image of Mother Earth becomes this big metaphor for an agricultural product, but it then connects back to the lands and how important the land is. So there is this kind of larger planetarity and transnationality of agriculture that's at play.
We have a quick question, Dr. Montoya.
Sure, what is that question?
So we have two. So the first one is from Celeste Nunez. She's asking if there's time, could you please expand on the difference between the UNESCO designations? And then we have a comment / question from Dr. Emile Nakle. And they say, I'm wondering whether the centuries-old agricultural fields in the Nile Delta, modern day Egypt, can be included in this discussion, especially as this type of agriculture was practiced in the time of the pharaohs and continues to be practiced today. The Nile Delta has been a critical part of the Egyptian cultural life.
Absolutely. So maybe there's even a way to answer the two of them or discuss them together. And I invite anybody to chime in as we're doing that. Let's take a step back and go back to the two designations. So we have cultural or natural. And one of the designations, cultural significance primarily, is related around, there are over 10, I think there are 7 or 8 different criteria, but one of the ways in which an application for a UNESCO World Heritage designation goes under cultural is that it has, for example, one of the examples is having unique human significance or a unique example of human genius. So for example, the pyramids of Giza would be considered a human construct. So they're not a natural landscape, but they do have cultural significance in that they were an example of human, quote unquote, genius, or some sort of rare example of something that exists in the world. The example of a natural site would have different criteria, one of which would be, for example, in the Franklin River Dam case that we talked about, or the Franklin River in Tasmania, it had unique characteristics of natural significance or that have occurred naturally that represent the ecosystems and spaces of planet Earth. And so there is this kind of element of it happened and occurred naturally, like the Carlsbad Caverns, but they also have some unique significance to the tapestry of living in the world, right? It's just that they're not man-made or human-made, or did not have some sort of element of what they're referring to as human genius inside of that element. Does that make sense, Celeste?
Can I add to that?
Yeah, sure, Francis, please.
What I would add to that, though, is that that's a purely Western way of dividing up the world into natural and cultural. Okay, and that's not how most humans have thought about the world for most of human history. So that's a very it's a lot of people would see that as a very artificial distinction. So Manuel was just talking about environmental personhood, and it's not just a legal technique to protect rivers or mountains or whatever from exploitation. It is actually related to many people's ways of seeing the world. So where I work, I'm an archaeologist and anthropologist, and I work in the Andes. And where I work, the landscape is living. The earth is living. Is in particular region is referred to as Pachamama, right? So the Earth Mother, and provides for people. Mountain peaks are seen as living beings that take care of people. And so for your proper behavior, you're taken care of by receiving water, for example, from significant peaks. It's the same thing here in North America, in Indigenous North America. And so the personhood isn't just sort of a legal thing to for protection. It is a way actually of how a lot of people actually see the world. So yeah, I can take a stab at the second question too, unless did you?
Yeah, please do. No, please do.
Yeah, no, I can't say much about the specific practices in the Nile Delta because I'm not closely familiar with them, but I think there's many places in the world, right, where people are practicing ways of agriculture that have been resilient and sustainable over centuries, right? And so we have both the landscapes that may or may not be listed as World Heritage sites, but there's also the knowledge, right, that goes along with how you farm these landscapes over time, and that may or may not be listed under intangible cultural properties, which I think Manuel is going to talk a little bit more about. But I think the list you gave, Manuel, was that was actual agricultural landscapes versus examples of agricultural knowledge, right?
Right, that's correct.
Okay,
That's correct.
yeah, because we need
Although
to think about the knowledge. It's not just the physical landscape, it's the knowledge of how that landscape should be farmed and has been farmed over centuries.
Yes, yeah, but precisely. And thank you for that, because the epistemological part of that is extremely important. It's not just about the legalities, it's about ways of knowing the world and ways of thinking about the world that are endemic to these sites. The Palmeral has some of that knowledge element in the application, but it's I would assume actually that along the Nile and the Delta, that's actually part of what we then kind of connect to some of the elements of Egyptian civilization as well. I wanted to touch on the idea of indigenous New Mexican epistemology as well. I finished rereading Gregory Cajete's Sante and the idea of thinking like the mountain. And there is this really great way of, that actually maps onto also Jose Rivera's discussion about acequias within New Mexico. And really, those books really just touch on agricultural landscapes as ways of thinking. And so this is really archival knowledge, and it's not just about protecting from human progress or the human interface. And so, yeah, thank you for catching that, Francis. I appreciate that. That's actually where I'm going to kind of lead to here. One of the other things I wanted to hopefully touch upon is this kind of idea of those state duties again, and the idea of fragile states. One of the things that I noticed in this cursory account that I did of agricultural landscapes is that of all those fragile spaces, if one could use something like the Fragile States Index, which is a measure developed by the Fund for Peace. I can post that information on the YouTube video later on. But the 16 factors within the Fragile States Index show that 9 of 10, so that's really, really high, of the agricultural properties on that danger list are also in nations that are in the lower half of the Fragile State Index. So there's an instability or an unstable category designated to these places. Now, even though that's a cursory quantitative reference, it really shows that these places, that there's a vulnerability that comes both from the human-centric thinking and the non-human-centric thinking perspectives about like this question of vulnerability of these landscapes. And so it gets us thinking also about the fragility of how one preserves and lifts up the voices of places where that knowledge is trying to contribute to society and does on a regular basis. I did want to touch again, just to revisit it, the high jurisdiction issue of the Franklin River case, because I'm not going to go into it all over again, but just as a reminder from our last session, we talked about how the natural landscape of the Franklin River actually became one of the causes for developing a way to supersede the Australian government's ability to either permit or not permit a dam project in Tasmania. And so it's very interesting to see that this knowledge base also, it was a recognition of what the landscape was teaching us in a way that is rarely used in this kind of almost kind of modern Western legal tradition. So I think that this is one of those rare cases where that intersection has also occurred. I want to stop there and also ask, how does climate change shift this vulnerability on other global issues? I think there's an open discussion that I'd like to have about what climate change is doing or other global issues in the way that agricultural landscapes are changed. And I think this then kind of connects to Francis's point. Ways of knowing the world, bodies of knowledge are contested and made vulnerable by these global forces. And so I want to stop here. I want to pause as a presenter, and I just want to open up for discussion about what you guys think. And you guys can pick any of these topics: climate change, migration, energy availability, conflict resources, population, ethnic violence, and intersectionality. I put in purple ethnic violence because I think that's a very interesting one that doesn't get talked about always in relation to agricultural landscapes, but it is a very deeply connected one. So I just want to stop and open up any question or comments. Francis, please feel free to chime in on these issues because you have you published on this sort of stuff. So I'd really love to hear your thoughts and the thoughts of others.
Let's hear from the audience first to see if you folks have any questions.
Yeah.
I want to add something, well, not to add, but just to point out something that I noticed. And answering to the question that how does climate change shift this vulnerability? I think that in general, climate change just exacerbates the way in which the vulnerability is going to be seen in future years. Because I think that in general, the more strong certain institutions are within certain countries, the better their natural resources, and in this case, the natural landscapes can be preserved. But when you couple low or weak institutions within countries and climate change, this is just going to be something that probably won't hold for some years or even for some decades. So I think in general, climate change just exacerbates the way in which many of the cultural landscapes, and in this case, agricultural landscapes, will not be able to survive to the extent that we would like.
Yeah, that's a great point. It makes me think also that in amplifying the issues that are already vulnerable within these spaces, I also think that there's a way that we can characterize climate change as the landscape speaking. And so there is already kind of a dialogue between the landscape and the places themselves that are wrought from human activity, that I think that is also part of this. Like, how is the world speaking to us? And if we're going to talk about global heritage, it can't always be about human beings speaking on behalf of the world. There is also this kind of idea that the world is actually knocking on our door and reminding us of certain things as we talk about shifts in climate and shifts in environment. So I think that's a really, really important point to mention. There was a hand raised, I think there is.
We have two hands raised.
Cool.
I think that was me.
Thank you, Emil. Yes.
Thank you, Manuel. This slide is very critical because climate change, of course, affects agriculture, migration patterns, energy availability, and then ethnic violence. The fact is, even in our global and national security program, we include under human security, we include food, water, and energy. And Chris Duval teaches that course and discusses these issues. These are very, very critical issues. In fact, when you look at so many of these societies, we begin with the security question, but really the heart of the security question is this agriculture, population movement patterns, energy availability. We see that today in so many countries. When we look at state security, we discover that essentially the population does not have food security, water security, and energy security. And the fact that we see so many climate refugees in the Mediterranean today from Africa attests to this reality. So I think, Manuel, I think this slide is very critical.
Thank you, Emil. I agree. I'm going to yield to Francis because I think this kind of question also about Western modernity and kind of these views about security, I think, are embedded in the things that Francis mentioned earlier. But Francis, I'm hoping that you have some thoughts on that as well. And then we have another person, I think, also that had their hand raised.
Yes.
Yeah, I think what I would add to that is, and I don't know how many of you before our meeting actually took a look at what's on the list for the the intangible cultural properties and such, and it seems like there's a big disconnect between like the real reason why these landscapes and these knowledge systems are actually threatened. and the kinds of things that are listed. So there's like, and these are all, of course, important things to preserve. So it's like a ritual or, songs or festival about this particular agricultural practice. And it's not that you just have to list that on the list. It's just, well, why is it threatened? Like, what are all the different things that are happening in these people's lives, right? These are usually, like Manuel, you said, they're in the, they're vulnerable populations, right? They're marginalized populations. And that are more vulnerable to climate change, that are the most vulnerable to, when there's political unrest. And so just to focus only on preserving the things that people will think of as cultural, the dances and other things like that, isn't sort of really getting at the root of why the people themselves are vulnerable. And so, yeah, so I don't know if that's a discussion you guys have already started having about what kinds of things get listed, and is listing sufficient, or are you actually thinking about the root causes of why these landscapes and these practices are in fact being threatened?
Yeah, that's a really, really important point. And I couldn't emphasize enough that the convention itself in 1972 never really discussed. It had criteria that then you fit and you apply for them, but you never really discuss why they need to be a part of World Heritage in that way. Yes.
Right.
And
why?
That's just
Why they're at risk.
gap.
It's not just like, oh, times are changing and these people are at risk, or these practices are at risk. Not even these people are at risk, because it is the people that are at risk. But anyway, Emmy, I think you've had your hand up for a while.
Yes.
Yes, thank you. I would love to hear the presenters' thoughts on particularly how the current pandemic may have caused shifts in vulnerability, as well as any sort of responses by UNESCO or other bodies, particularly in response to the pandemic, and whether that has shifted anything on the kind of more institutional level, particularly when it comes to deciding what should be listed, to go back to Francis's point, and who is at risk, as of course the pandemic has caused, perhaps one could hope, a shifting in kind of global priorities.
Yeah, that's that's a complex one to unpack, Emmy. Thank you for bringing it up. It's one that I think we should reflect on even after this session ends. I think my short answer to that very complex question is that, on the one hand, COVID accelerated a lot of the inequalities and vulnerabilities that are occurring all over the world. So even though there are all these other issues, you could argue to connect some of the threads that have been brought up by other people here in this call, you could say that it accelerated the kind of ethnic violence that is done to people when their place is being erased from the record, the human record, because there's a different kind of urgency. There's a scramble going on, and at that point, limited resources get diverted to the urgency of COVID, where there are other things that are actually being left by the wayside. And you'll actually even notice in this year's UNESCO list that they focus primarily on intangible heritage. And that was one of the reasons that they did that. There was a selection of this year's candidates. It wasn't about physical locations, partially because people couldn't travel to then kind of vet out. Normally that process is about visiting the place and being able to have a discussion with people about the place. But it was also about this kind of idea that we're now kind of disembodied, like COVID disembodied us. And we now have this kind of identity. Look at us, I'm a talking head on Zoom. And this kind of disembodied kind of thing is also now the bigger question is like, how do we have culture in that? And what is our heritage in response to that as well? So we're also kind of delocating and deterritorializing space at the same time that we're doing that. So those are a bunch of like threads and factors. Do I have an answer? No. Did the World Heritage Convention have an answer? No, it did not also. It did not address any of these threads that we're discussing here. And I think were we to revise hypothetically for the 50th anniversary, I think that the things that have been mentioned here are of vital importance. Other questions and comments? It's really great. I'm going to move to New Mexico on this. And I think this is where intangibility, I apologize. I had a factoid about intangible heritage on this slide, and I don't know where it went. So I'm gonna just apologize in advance for this. But the key thing here is intangible heritage, as Francis has been referring to a couple of times throughout this discussion. The idea of intangible heritage comes in about 20 years after the convention. It's mentioned in the convention, but it's not explicitly stated. And that's part of the problem, is that I think one of the original aims of the convention is to actually generate tourism. And tourism is not necessarily equated with heritage in this context. It's a fast and easy move we can make, and it's an important part of it. But if you'll notice, certain bodies of knowledge, it's not about being able to observe a space for what it's doing. It's about the values that actually emanate from those places and how those values are done. A really great example of that are the acequias here in New Mexico. So about 7 years ago, the student group that I work with, IBSG, we did a mock exercise on what it would take to get the acequias designated as an intangible heritage for UNESCO. And boy, was that an eye-opener. It brought up all of the roadblocks that would be possible for that. And one of the bigger challenges was being able to demonstrate how the physicality of the space actually then leads to the region itself of acequias, how it actually leads to certain practices. And if you hear certain experts talking about acequias, that's one of the things you'll note, is that they talk about it's more epistemological, right? For example, when you are in an acequia, you're not necessarily just, it's taught to think about resources in relation to time and providence. And those things are not in the equation in most Western ways of thinking about resources. It's a way of knowing and thinking about the world that is a little bit different than what you would get out of, for example, the state engineer's office in the state government, right? If there's scarce water, you still have time. You know, being somebody who's an acequiero here in the South Valley, when we're irrigating in our property, we don't have acre feet that we're designated to be able to kind of give out water. We're given a day. We're given 2 hours or 3 hours or whatever it is that we're given. And that allocation is more about time. It doesn't matter how much water comes through in that period of time. It's an approximation of time, not space. And that's an epistemological difference that is common in different parts of the world. But again, that value system is a really, really important one that we can actually think about as a way of knowing that comes from the space. Same thing with hornos. Same thing with practices of actually making certain kinds of foods. There's ways of knowing how to do those sorts of things and values that emanate from that we don't necessarily think about. I see the chat came up with another blinker. I don't know if there's somebody that has a question.
I just said thank you very much.
Oh, yes. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. The last thing I'll say about New Mexico, and I want to just open up to just generally talking about New Mexico and how it represents this issue, is unincorporated properties. Another thing that the World Heritage Convention does, I think, very quickly, not only does it kind of give states the authority to be kind of the proxy for taking care of world heritage, but it also doesn't identify those non-spaces or those places that don't have a very formalized, in the Western sense, system of governance. Like unincorporated areas are a big part of New Mexico's landscape. I come from a county that doesn't have any incorporated spaces. Maybe Wagon Mound is the only one in the entirety of Mora County, but all the other places are not formally incorporated as villages or towns and cities. They're agricultural landscapes that have basically been unified under the agricultural identity of the space. And so again, unincorporated places are actually big parts of the way that we govern and the way that we think about governance. And so I wanted to kind of just throw those examples out there and see if you guys had others in New Mexico that represent these issues that we've been talking about today.
Speaking has been permitted to all the attendees, just so everybody knows, so you feel free to unmute yourself and please go ahead and comment.
I think Emil has his hand raised.
Yes.
May I make just a comment about acequias? They, of course, I looked at those when I was growing up. We were using the same method in these little villages outside Nazareth in Palestine, and they were assigning water to individual farmers for 2 hours a day, either morning or evening. And the word asikia, of course, is an Arabic word still used called sakia, which came to New Mexico from Spain, and the Moors developed that system in Spain, and that system is still used in so many rural areas in the Levant, that is Palestine, parts of Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, and still referred to that little canal of water as a sakia, which is very interesting. When I heard the word here in New Mexico, and I went down to the South Valley and I saw them, I said, my gosh, this is what has been used all over the world, at least the world I was familiar with. So I just wanted to give this as a context. And then the unincorporated lands, that remains an issue in the Middle East today, because that was the system that the Ottoman Empire established in its domains, millions of square miles. Basically, you farm the land, but you really don't own the land. And then different farmers farm that land, and they did not establish an incorporated village or town. It's just agricultural communities, and they were known as agricultural communities rather than towns or villages incorporated. And they kind of manage their own affairs totally informally without a formal government in that community. Just wanted to present this as almost a context of the two issues that Manuel raised so effectively.
Thank you, Emil. That's a really, really great point. I really appreciate you sharing the context. It also makes me realize that in the big economic context, if we're going to talk about World Heritage, one of the pieces that's often missing from that equation is the parts that are not formally recognized as in terms of economics or politics. And the parallel economy, the informal economy, a lot of people think it's the illicit economy, like illegal stuff. No, the parallel economy is things that aren't formally recognized within the quote unquote formal economy. And those formal structures have the same problem in World Heritage as they do in economics, is that basically, if we're going to talk about world economic activity and the shaping of the world economy, which is a big part of World Heritage, half of the world's economy is informal and unaccounted for.
Yeah.
And so now we're talking about also really kind of the massive economic scale and force of this really kind of undesignated, and the designation actually comes from these international structures that come from the end of the Second World War. So I really think that when we're talking about World Heritage, the problem is also kind of reinforcing itself in other things that we see in economics and politics. I do want to recognize that Dr. Nicole Tommy from the Global Education Office has joined us as well. Welcome, and welcome to everybody else who signed on before I saw this. We've had great contributions from people who are attending. The floor is generally open. I think the last slide that I had, that is actually the last slide I had. I wanted to end with New Mexico, and I wanted to talk a little bit about from our context, what are we doing here that has something to say about the world, and that's something that I want to keep going alive.
Manuel, I'm just curious, when you and others were thinking about getting the, acequias and acequia knowledge listed, what were the particular barriers you ran into? Because there are a couple examples from, from other parts of the world where irrigation systems are registered.
Yeah, I think that's one of the challenges of the process of World Heritage, applying for World Heritage. And it's not necessarily about the convention, but about the process, which I would think would need some revising, is that when you have something like Intangible Heritage and it's already present in the UNESCO registry, it becomes very difficult to make an argument about the distinctiveness of that. So I know people, we actually interviewed people who were part of the Palmeral, the Elche application, and we talked to them. We even did interviews with them. And then they were saying that, there's places in San Antonio, for example, that have acequias, that have a very similar kind of thing. The problem is that everybody is regionally competing for the distinctiveness of the region for this intangible heritage. And in the US, as many other places, you have to get a national parks designation in order to then kind of move forward with with some of these aspects. The intangible heritage, you get kind of a break, but that was the biggest obstacle. Is you then have to if you're not going to get a national parks designation kind of pass to move into to qualify for applying for a UNESCO heritage site, then you're going to have to make a much bigger argument. And I'm talking even in volume of pages. We saw the Palmeral, it was like 250 pages of arguments about why the region connects to the intangibility of this way of knowing the world. And that's really, you're basically authoring a massive book on why that connection is made. But once that's established, how does anybody ever get included into that again without then kind of arguing about the regional distinctiveness problem?
But then it makes you, wonder about, just what the real purpose is. Because if on the one hand it's, it's supposed to be preservation, right? But then it's so hard, unless you're absolutely unique, it then seems to undermine the whole, ability of, all these other places that are doing, that have these important practices and landscapes, of ever being able to be protected.
Exactly. And I think that goes to Emil's context as well. I mean, an acequia is a word that can be used in Nazareth as much as it is in Dixon, New Mexico. And that should be evidence that it's World Heritage, right?
Right.
But instead, ironically, it pits those applications against each other. And that competitiveness is, I guess, the structural part of the world order at the end of World War II. Like everybody then has their own that kind of self-contained sovereignty becomes a problem when you want to share in the question of heritage. So there's an element of not cannibalizing your own applications inside of the heritage process that I think is an important thing that comes out of this discussion.
But it also ignores the hundreds of years of history since that the acequias have here in New Mexico.
Exactly, it's arbitrary. San Antonio and Nazareth and Spain, they all have the connection. So why do you need a national parks designation to apply for this? It boggles me when you get to that point in the paperwork.
I'd love to hop in on this conversation. So not everybody here may know, but here with Global Ties, we conduct the International Visitor Leadership Program with the US Department of State. And one of the most recent programs we had was on the topic of cultural preservation. And from Albuquerque, New Mexico, we had speakers from the state and as well as the national parks here in New Mexico. And they came to meet with these Middle Eastern world leaders to discuss best practices in preservation. And it was so interesting to me that the superintendents we met with from Chaco Culture Canyon and the Petroglyph National Monument. And it was really interesting because they were discussing how they have to cooperate and learn from the Native Americans that, are from that land, and to learn the best practices from them on how they want the land and the sites to be preserved. And the superintendent from Chaco Culture was saying that the Native American leaders that they meet with don't want them to reconstruct the buildings that are, or the walls that are falling, or, you know, the buildings that are falling apart, because historically they haven't tried to rebuild it. And, you know, it ties in with the culture of how, of the life cycle of something, of someone, of like, they don't want to force it to come back to life. And I think it was really interesting listening to those conversations.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I mean, there's an ephemerality to world culture as well, there's a discussion that's happening about like what is the purpose, right? And not only that, but how are we essentializing when we kind of arbitrarily decide that we're going to fix certain parts and we're not going to fix others, and you know, we're going to make sure that that's intact. Like, why, right? Those questions don't get asked. And I think to Francis's point, I think the big takeaway from especially what the problem of agriculture, as World Heritage teaches us, is that we're not asking why. We don't actually explore the story of how world culture comes to be inside of these the voices that these agricultural landscapes interacts with. And as a result of that, we're really kind of missing the point. I mean, it's not a thing to put a plaque and, you know, just say, you know, this is like preserved and, you know, come visit and take your picture. This is not a selfie moment. This is an archival moment of the sum of human knowledge that is learned from these spaces.
And another important point was that because there's such distrust between the Native American community and the US government, like the superintendents wanted to know how and why they wanted to preserve in certain ways, and they just wouldn't get any clear answers, because those are sacred information. Sometimes it's personal, sometimes, you know, you just never know. But they were very much emphasizing on like the distrust and how they didn't want to share like the reasons and the ways in which they would want stuff to be preserved.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'd actually welcome anybody to chime in on that as well. Because these spaces, knowledge is not always cut and dry and really neat. Knowledge is an act of resistance sometimes. And we live in a state where there's, you know, a huge percentage of public lands, and they are managed by the federal government. Bureau of Land Management, US Forestry, National Park Service are among those. Bureau of Indian Affairs intersects with native territories and native lands. But the bigger question then becomes like, who gets permission to say what a land is for, and what is the voice of that landscape, and is it a site of resistance? Because we don't normally acknowledge as heritage the things that are resisting, right? We want to kind of just assume, and we create this harmonious narrative about World Heritage, that World Heritage just happens, this kind of elegant, the pyramids just happened, but for the fact that slavery was a big part of the pyramids, right? But you know, now it's just, you can take a picture by the pyramids, but you know, you don't really want to talk about, actually, this is a site that is memorialized also as a site of trauma, as a site of resistance. I was looking through the sites, and you can go through the UNESCO list on the website. Again, the PowerPoint, I hope we can post those in different places, because if you take a look at the list themselves, one of the things that pops out quite often are those places that have no UNESCO designation. And you'll notice again that those are places that have extremely unstable, they're marked as extremely unstable, Rwanda being a very good example. And there is like very key moments in World Heritage that could be associated with the area that contains Rwanda as well. So it's really problematic in a way that I think if we're gonna be serious about World Heritage in the next 50 years, I think that there has to be some attention paid to some of these voices that are not shared.
Dominic Baca just dropped in the chat a brief article about acequias in a small northwestern community on San Mateo. Interesting, because it refers to acequias as a form of governance. So I think that's an interesting topic.
Yeah, thank you, Dominic. I mean, he's referring to the New Mexico Acequia Association, lasacequias.org, and they have some really great information. If you've never seen their website, go check it out, because they're not talking about acequias physically. Most of the time, they're talking about what happens, the knowledge that comes out that Francis is talking about. So, good resource. Thank you.
Yeah, it's the not, and I think I didn't read the article, Dominic, but a lot of traditional irrigation communities, they have all kinds of cultural practices to ensure the equal distribution of water, and so social organization parallels irrigation organization, and again, these are ways of managing water from the bottom up, from farmers managing their water to ensure the equal distribution of water, and versus other systems where more top down, that may in fact be less resilient over time.
Thank you for elaborating, Dr. Hayashida. I appreciate it. Yes, I think it's particularly interesting because as a primary form of government, it's almost subconscious. We can look back and see these things the way we do now, but it's intriguing to think about the ways in which the knowledge was perceived at the time. And so, no, thank you for your elaboration, and thank you, Dr. Montoya, particularly for your talk today.
Oh, no, it really is like it's built on your curiosity and your interest. So I appreciate you guys being here. I know that we're at the time. We're at time. So, are there any last questions or comments that anybody wants to leave us with? Okay, so then just on behalf of Anderson, and also in great thank you, Francis and LAII. Thank you, Nicole with GEO Global Education Office, and thank you, Sila and Yuri from Global Ties. You guys rock. And we'll have this recording available. We have now session 1 and session 2 that'll be available on the YouTube channel. Session 3 is going to be in a few weeks. I don't remember the date, but actually everybody in attendance will be receiving another invitation for the next session. And that's going to be about science fiction, space aliens, digital identity, space commerce, and all of those things that really were not on the radar screen for the World Heritage Convention, and how they're going to be recognized at some point. What is the frontier of that sort of thing? So I'm looking forward to that next step. So thank you very much for your time, everyone. Have a wonderful weekend, and we'll see you at the next session, hopefully.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care.